before Egypt raised its first pyramid, before Sumer built its first ziggurat, before Stonehenge stood in an English field, before the wheel had fully entered human life. There was a civilization that painted its world in spirals. It left behind no writing, no kings whose names we can read, no monuments of stone. And yet it left behind something rarer, a body of art so intricate, so mathematically precise, and so spiritually loaded that even now, more than 5,000 years later, we are still trying to understand what it meant. We call this civilization Cucuteni-Trypillia, a name stitched together from two villages an ocean of time apart from us, Cucuteni in modern Romania and Trypillia near Kiev in Ukraine. In these two places, more than a century ago, archaeologists first uncovered the shattered, painted fragments of a people who had vanished so completely that Europe forgot they had ever existed. What they found was strange. Beautiful, orange-red pottery, covered edge to edge in painted spirals, waves, and concentric circles, made with a level of symmetry that seems almost impossible for a culture without the wheel, without metal tools, without writing. Alongside the pottery, thousands of small clay figurines, most of them women, abstract and faceless, their bodies marked with the same spiraling lines as the pots. And beneath the soil, something even stranger. Entire settlements, not villages, but small cities, some larger than early Uruk in Mesopotamia, that had been deliberately, ritually, and repeatedly burned to the ground. This is the story of a civilization that painted almost everything it touched, not for decoration alone, but, it seems, to speak a language of circles and spirals, of sun and rain, of birth and death and the turning of seasons. A visual language whose grammar we can partially reconstruct, even if its full meaning is now lost to time. This is the story of the painted world. To understand the art, we first have to understand the people who made it, as best as the archaeological record allows. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture flourished across a vast stretch of Eastern Europe, in the territory of what is today Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine, roughly between 5,500 and 2750 BCE. That is not a typo. This culture began taking shape while much of Europe was still deep in its Stone Age, and it endured, evolved, and eventually faded away over the course of nearly 3,000 years, a span of time longer than the distance between us and ancient Rome. They were farmers. Their economy rested on wheat, barley, peas, and lentils, grown in the extraordinarily fertile black soil, the Chernozem, of the forest steppe region. This is some of the richest agricultural land on Earth, and it allowed Cucuteni-Trypillia communities to grow food surpluses substantial enough to support large, dense populations without the need for large-scale irrigation works. They kept cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. They hunted deer and wild boar in the surrounding woodlands when needed, and they fished the rivers that threaded through their territory, the Dniester, the Prut, the southern bug. Their world was one of rolling steppe grassland interrupted by forest, cut through by slow rivers, a landscape generous enough to sustain a civilization without cities in the way we usually imagine them, and yet dense enough with settlement that in places it verged on something very close to urban life. They built their houses from wood and clay, in a technique called wattle and daub, a woven frame of branches packed and plastered with clay, then often painted or decorated. Some houses had 2 stories. Many had raised clay platforms inside that served as household shrines, ovens built from clay, and beautifully painted pottery arranged as though on display. What is most striking about Cucuteni-Trypillia society, at least based on the evidence we have, is what is missing. There are no palaces, no fortresses, no elite burials loaded with weapons and gold. No clear evidence of a warrior class, a standing army, or centralized kings. Weapons, in the sense of dedicated tools of war, are rare in the archaeological record. This does not mean these societies were without conflict. No human society ever fully is. But it does suggest something unusual for a civilization of this size and duration. A social order that, for whatever reason, did not organize itself primarily around military hierarchy or dynastic rule, at least not in ways visible to archaeology. Instead, what we find again and again is art. Painted pottery, clay figurines, models of houses and furniture, symbols repeated with an almost obsessive consistency across enormous distances and centuries of time. If Cucuteni-Trypillia had a monument to leave behind for the future, it was not stone. It was the painted surface of a clay pot. The story of how we came to know this civilization at all is, in its own way, a story worth telling. In 1884, a Romanian scholar named Teodor Baroda, investigating a hill near the village of Cucuteni in northeastern Romania, discovered fragments of painted pottery unlike anything known from the region. The style was distinctive: burnt orange clay, painted with dark spirals and geometric bands, fired with a technical skill that seemed out of place for what was assumed to be a primitive prehistoric culture. A few years later, in the 1890s, on the other side of the region, a Ukrainian archaeologist of Czech origin named Vikenty Kvoyka began excavating near the village of Trypillia, south of Kyiv. What he found there echoed what had been found at Cucuteni: the same painted spirals, the same style of figurines, the same evidence of large, organized settlements. At first, these were treated as two separate discoveries. It took years of careful comparative work for archaeologists to recognize that Cucuteni in Romania and Trypillia in Ukraine were, in fact, expressions of the same broad cultural tradition, separated by geography but united by a shared visual and material language. Today, the culture carries both names together: Cucuteni-Trypillia, a small act of historical justice to two independent discoveries that turned out to be two windows into the same lost world. For much of the 20th century, our picture of this civilization remained fragmentary, built site by site, potsherd by potsherd. It was not until the latter half of the century, and especially from the 1970s onward, with the arrival of aerial photography and later magnetometry, a technique that maps buried structures by detecting subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field, that the true scale of Cucuteni-Trypillia settlement became clear. And that scale turned out to be staggering. When archaeologists first began mapping certain Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements from the air, many assumed there had been some kind of error. Sites like Talianki, Majdanetsky, and Nebelivka, located in what is now central Ukraine, revealed settlement plans of an almost unbelievable size, some spreading across 200 to 300 hectares. To put that in perspective, that is larger than many city-states of the ancient Near East that would emerge thousands of years later. Population estimates for the largest of these sites range widely, from several thousand to, in some more generous calculations, upwards of 10 or even 15,000 people, numbers that, if accurate even at the lower end, would make these among the largest human settlements anywhere on Earth during the 4th millennium BCE. These were not haphazard clusters of huts, they were planned. Houses were arranged in concentric rings, sometimes multiple rings deep, radiating outward from open central spaces that may have served as gathering places, ritual grounds, or livestock pens. Streets, or at least consistent gaps between rows of houses, suggest at least some degree of coordinated urban planning, achieved without the aid of writing, without a bureaucracy in the traditional sense, and without any evidence of forced centralized authority. This is one of the great puzzles of the culture. How does a settlement of 10,000 people organize itself, build itself, and feed itself without kings, without a warrior aristocracy, and without a system of writing to record debts, taxes, or laws? Archaeologists still debate the answer. Some suggest a kind of communal, consensus-based decision-making, perhaps organized around kinship groups or household clusters, each responsible for its own section of the settlement. Others suggest ritual and shared belief. The very art and symbolism we're about to explore may have functioned as a kind of social glue, a unifying visual language that held together a society too large to govern through personal relationships alone. What's certain is that these megasites did not last as static, permanent cities in the way we might imagine. Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements, even the enormous ones, appear to have had a kind of built-in impermanence. Every so often, some archaeologists estimate every 1 or 2 generations, a settlement, or at least significant parts of it, would be deliberately burned, and then, quite often, rebuilt nearby, sometimes on the very same spot. We'll return to this mystery. It is one of the strangest and most debated aspects of the entire civilization. But first, let's turn to what most people associate with Cucuteni-Trypillia above all else: the art itself. If you were to walk into a museum gallery dedicated to Cucuteni-Trypillia pottery, the first thing that would strike you is not any single object, but the overwhelming, almost dizzying consistency of design. Vessel after vessel, spanning centuries and hundreds of kilometers, share a visual vocabulary so distinct that it is instantly recognizable, even to an untrained eye. The pottery itself was made without a wheel. The potter's wheel would not arrive in this region for many centuries yet. Instead, vessels were built by hand, using coiling techniques, in which long ropes of clay were layered and smoothed into shape, then fired in kilns that could reach temperatures sufficient to harden the clay to a durable, ringing solid. Some kilns used by Cucuteni-Trypillia potters were remarkably sophisticated two-chambered structures, allowing for more controlled and even firing than a simple open pit, a level of technical mastery that speaks to generations of accumulated, transmitted knowledge. Once fired, the vessels were painted, and it is here that the culture's most extraordinary artistic achievement lies. Early Cucuteni-Trypillia pottery tends to use simpler techniques. Incised or grooved patterns cut into the wet clay before firing, sometimes filled afterward with white paste to make the design stand out against the darker body of the pot. But over the centuries, the culture developed an increasingly refined painting tradition, using natural pigments, red and orange ochres, black manganese or iron-based paint, and white clay slip, applied directly to the surface before or after firing. By the culture's classic period, Cucuteni-Trypillia potters were producing what specialists call bichrome and polychrome ware, vessels painted in 2 or 3 colors simultaneously, often black and white over a rich orange-red background, creating a striking, almost luminous contrast. The precision of these designs is remarkable. Spirals coil around the belly of a vessel in perfectly matched, mirrored pairs. Bands of parallel lines curve with the shape of the pot, as though the potter had planned the entire composition before a single brushstroke was made, which, in all likelihood, is exactly what happened. Consider what this required. There was no potter's wheel to provide rotational symmetry automatically. Every curve, every spiral, every repeated unit of pattern had to be measured, planned, and executed by hand and eye alone, on a three-dimensional curved surface, using pigments that could not be erased or easily corrected. And yet the results, seen today in museums from Kyiv to Chisinau to Iași, display a level of geometric sophistication that any modern designer would admire. This was not folk decoration applied absent-mindedly to fill empty space. This was a deliberate visual system, refined over dozens of generations, and it was applied to almost everything the culture made: pottery for storage, for cooking, for ritual use, and even purely symbolic miniature vessels that seem to have served no practical function at all, existing only to be looked at, perhaps only to be understood. So what, exactly, did all of this painting mean? This is where we must proceed carefully. The people of Cucuteni-Trypillia left us no texts, no inscriptions, no first-person account of their beliefs. Everything we say about the meaning of their symbols is an interpretation, built from patterns in the archaeological record, from comparison with other prehistoric and early historic cultures, and, cautiously, from anthropological study of later agricultural societies whose belief systems were still rooted in the natural cycles of sun, rain, and harvest. Scholars disagree, sometimes sharply, on how far we can push these interpretations. What follows is the most widely shared reading among archaeologists who specialize in this material, offered with the humility such an ancient and silent record demands. The single most dominant motif in Cucuteni-Trypillia art is the spiral. It appears everywhere, wrapped around the bellies of storage vessels, coiling across bowls, framing the limbs and torsos of clay figurines. Sometimes spirals appear alone. More often, they appear in pairs, mirrored against one another, or interlocked in long, running chains that circle the entire vessel without a clear beginning or end. Many archaeologists interpret the spiral as a solar and cyclical symbol, a representation of the sun's movement, of time itself turning through the seasons, of the endless repeating cycle of planting, growth, harvest, death, and rebirth that would have structured every year of an agricultural community's existence. A spiral has no true end. It can be read as continuously unwinding outward or continuously winding inward forever. For a farming people whose entire survival depended on understanding and anticipating cyclical time, the return of spring, the turning of the seasons, the movements of the sun across the sky, a symbol that visually embodies endless, unbroken cycle would carry an obvious and powerful resonance. Closely related to the spiral is the concentric circle, often nested 3, 4, or 5 circles deep, frequently interpreted as a more direct solar symbol, the sun itself, or perhaps the sun's disk as it appears in the sky. On many vessels, concentric circles are placed prominently on the upper portion of the pot, in a position that some scholars suggest mirrors the sun's position in the sky relative to the earth below. Then there are the wavy, undulating lines, sometimes called serpentine bands, that ripple across the lower registers of many vessels. These are widely interpreted as representations of water, rivers, rain, or the life-giving moisture without which the black soil of the forest steppe could produce nothing at all. In a civilization built entirely on the fortunes of agriculture, the association between painted water symbols and vessels meant to store grain or liquid seems almost too logical to dismiss. The meander, a continuous zigzagging or right-angled line, related to but distinct from the spiral, appears with similar frequency and is sometimes read as a more abstract representation of flowing movement, whether of water, of time, or of pathways between the human world and something beyond it. What is crucial to understand is that these symbols rarely appear in isolation. A single vessel might combine spirals near its shoulder, concentric circles near its neck, and wavy water lines near its base, arranged, some scholars argue, into a kind of visual cosmology: sky above, sun in its place, water and the cycle of growth below. The pot itself becomes a small model of the universe as its makers understood it: heaven, sun, and earth, compressed onto a curved clay surface and placed at the center of the household, holding the grain that sustained the family through the winter. This is, admittedly, an interpretation, an educated reading of pattern and placement, not a translated text. But the consistency of this cosmological arrangement, repeated across centuries and across a territory spanning modern-day Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine, suggests it was not random. Somewhere in these repeating spirals and circles and waves lies the outline of a shared belief system, a way of understanding the world that an entire civilization agreed upon, generation after generation, without ever needing to write a single word of it down. Alongside the painted pottery, Cucuteni-Trypillia sites have yielded tens of thousands of small clay figurines, among the largest collections of prehistoric figurative art found anywhere in the world. The overwhelming majority of these figurines represent the female form. They are typically small, a few centimeters to perhaps 20 centimeters tall, made of fired clay and rendered in a style that is at once abstract and deliberate. Faces are often reduced to the barest suggestion: a pinched nose, sometimes no eyes or mouth at all. Bodies are frequently exaggerated in specific ways: wide hips, pronounced buttocks, and in many examples, an emphasized, sometimes swollen abdomen, which many archaeologists interpret as a reference to pregnancy or fertility. Breasts are often indicated but not elaborated. Arms are frequently reduced to small stumps or entirely omitted. And across the bodies of many of these figurines, the same painted or incised motifs found on the pottery reappear: spirals, meanders, and concentric patterns marked directly onto the clay skin. Some figurines were found seated on small, elaborately modeled clay thrones or chairs, sometimes elevated, sometimes placed within miniature clay models of houses or shrines, complete with tiny painted furniture, ovens, and grinding stones. At the site of Symbolism in Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered an entire miniature model interpreted by some as a domestic shrine, populated with multiple seated female figurines arranged around a small oven, a startlingly intimate glimpse into what may have been household ritual life nearly 6,000 years ago. What were these figurines for? The most widely cited interpretation, developed extensively by the Lithuanian-American archaeologist Marija Gimbutas in the latter half of the 20th century, holds that these figurines represent aspects of a great goddess, or a pantheon of female deities, central to what Gimbutas termed the religion of Old Europe, a broad network of Neolithic and Neolithic cultures across the Balkans, the Danube Basin, and the Pontic steppe that, in her view, shared a matrifocal, goddess-centered spiritual worldview before the arrival of patriarchal, sky god-worshipping cultures from the Eurasian steppe in later millennia. Gimbutas's theory captured enormous public imagination, and it remains an influential lens through which Cucuteni-Trypillia figurines are often popularly discussed. It's important, however, to note that many archaeologists today view her broader framework, a unified, peaceful, goddess-worshipping Old Europe, later violently supplanted by patriarchal invaders, as considerably oversimplified and, in places, not well supported by the wider evidence. Critics point out that the female-dominant imagery, while genuinely striking, does not necessarily prove a single, unified goddess religion. Nor does it necessarily indicate that these societies were matriarchal in social organization, a claim archaeology alone struggles to demonstrate conclusively for any prehistoric culture. What can be said with more confidence is this: female imagery was central, repeated, and clearly significant to Cucuteni-Trypillia spiritual and domestic life. The association with fertility symbolism, pregnant forms, spiral and grain-like markings, placement within household and shrine contexts, strongly suggests these figurines were connected to concerns of agricultural abundance, human fertility, household protection, or some blend of all three. Whether they represented a single goddess, multiple deities, ancestral figures, or something we don't yet have a name for, remains genuinely open. What is not in doubt is the sheer scale of the practice. Figurine making was not an occasional ritual curiosity, but an enormous, sustained, culture-wide tradition, repeated in household after household, generation after generation, for nearly 3,000 years. Male figurines do exist within the Cucuteni-Trypillia record, but they are far rarer, and animal figurines, cattle in particular, but also other domestic and wild species, appear as well, sometimes in contexts suggesting they too played a role in ritual life, perhaps connected to the herds upon which the community's wealth and survival partly depended. To fully understand Cucuteni-Trypillia symbolism, we need to step inside the house itself. Within many excavated dwellings, archaeologists have found raised clay platforms, sometimes interpreted as altars or household shrines, positioned prominently within the living space, often near the oven, the symbolic and practical heart of the home. On or near these platforms, figurines, miniature furniture models, and painted vessels are frequently found clustered together, suggesting a space set aside not just for storage or cooking, but for regular, perhaps daily, ritual practice. Miniature clay models of houses themselves have been discovered at several sites. Tiny painted replicas, complete with roofs, doorways, and even miniature interior furnishings, including tiny ovens, benches, and grinding querns. Some of these models contain miniature figurines inside them, as though depicting a ritual scene in progress, frozen in clay. Archaeologists sometimes interpret these as shrine models, offerings, or even a kind of prehistoric architectural blueprint used to plan or bless the construction of a real house. The oven itself appears to have held particular symbolic weight. In several sites, ovens were built in elaborate, decorated forms, sometimes shaped or marked in ways that echo the same spiral and circular motifs found on pottery. The oven was, of course, the source of warmth, cooked food, and by extension, life itself, a natural focal point for both the practical and the sacred dimensions of household life to converge. Taken together, this evidence suggests something important. For the people of Cucuteni-Trypillia, art and religion were not confined to grand temples or set apart from daily life. They were woven directly into the architecture of the home, into the pots that held the family's grain, into the oven that cooked the family's bread. The painted spiral on a storage jar was not simply decoration hung in a special building once a year. It lived in the kitchen. It was seen every day by every member of the household, from childhood to old age. In this sense, Cucuteni-Trypillia religion, whatever its precise beliefs, appears to have been deeply, thoroughly domestic, a faith practiced not primarily in grand public ceremony, but in the quiet, repeated rituals of ordinary household life. Let's step back now and consider the fuller picture that begins to emerge when we put the pottery, the figurines, and the house shrines together. Across nearly 3,000 years and a territory spanning hundreds of kilometers, the people of Cucuteni-Trypillia appear to have shared a remarkably stable set of visual ideas about how the world was structured. The sun, represented through circles and spirals, moving endlessly through the sky. Water, represented through wavy, serpentine lines, falling as rain, flowing as rivers, soaking into the black earth. The earth itself, represented through the swelling, pregnant forms of female figurines, receiving both rain and seed, and bringing forth grain and life in return. Some scholars have proposed that Cucuteni-Trypillia cosmology, as reconstructed from this material, envisioned a universe organized in layers or registers. Sky above, populated by sun and perhaps other celestial forces, a middle world of human and animal life, and an underworld or earth womb below, associated with fertility, death, and renewal. This tripartite structure, sky, middle world, underworld, recurs strikingly often in later Indo-European and pre-Indo-European mythologies across Eurasia, which leads some researchers to wonder whether Cucuteni-Trypillia cosmology represents an early, regional expression of ideas about the structure of the universe that were far more widely shared across ancient Europe and beyond. while others caution against assuming direct continuity across such vast stretches of time and cultural change. What makes this cosmology feel less like idle decoration and more like genuine belief is its consistency. If a single potter in a single generation had invented these spiral and wave designs purely as an aesthetic preference, we would expect to see far more variation, far more individual experimentation across the culture's enormous geographic and chronological span. Instead, we see a visual grammar so stable that pottery from sites hundreds of kilometers apart, made centuries apart, can still be immediately recognized as belonging to the same tradition. That kind of consistency does not happen by accident. It happens when a symbol system is being deliberately taught, generation after generation, potter to apprentice, mother to daughter, because the symbols carry meaning that the community considers worth preserving. We should be careful here not to overstate our certainty. We are archaeologists and storytellers, looking at fragments, quite literally in the case of the pottery, which is almost always recovered broken, its pieces scattered across a settlement and painstakingly reassembled. We do not have a Cucuteni-Trypillia priest to explain the cosmology in their own words. But the patterns are real, and they are consistent, and they point toward a civilization that had developed a rich, structured, and evidently important way of picturing the forces that governed their lives. The sun overhead, the rain that fed the fields, the earth that gave birth to the harvest, and the eternal, unbroken cycle that connected them all. It is tempting, when we talk about a civilization spanning nearly 3,000 years, to imagine it as static, a single, unchanging tradition frozen in place. But Cucuteni-Trypillia was very much alive, and it changed considerably over the course of its long history. Archaeologists typically divide the culture into several broad phases, often labeled with letters and numbers. An early phase, sometimes called pre-Cucuteni, followed by Cucuteni-A, then a transitional phase, Cucuteni-A to B, then Cucuteni-B, and a corresponding Trypillia sequence labeled with similar conventions. These phase names are technical shorthand, useful for specialists, but what matters for us is what they represent: a civilization that grew, adapted its techniques, expanded its territory, and gradually shifted the scale and organization of its settlements over time. In its earlier centuries, Cucuteni-Trypillia communities lived in smaller, more scattered villages. Pottery decoration in this period tended to favor incised and grooved patterns rather than painted ones, and figurine styles were somewhat simpler. Over the following centuries, painted pottery techniques developed and refined. The culture's territory expanded eastward and southward, and, most dramatically, settlement size began to grow, eventually producing the enormous megasites we discussed earlier, which represent the culture's later, most populous phase, roughly in the second half of the 4th millennium BCE. This trajectory, smaller communities gradually growing into some of the largest settlements of the prehistoric world, represents one of the most significant, if underappreciated, social experiments of the ancient world. And it happened, as far as the evidence shows, without the parallel development of the institutions we typically associate with large-scale urban life elsewhere. Without kings, without standing armies, without monumental temples built to glorify individual rulers, and without writing. It happened instead alongside an increasingly rich, increasingly standardized visual and religious culture, as though the growing scale of Cucuteni-Trypillia society was held together not by force, but by a shared world of symbols, ritual, and belief. Now we return to one of the strangest, most debated features of this entire civilization, the burning of the houses. Across Cucuteni-Trypillia sites, archaeologists have found overwhelming evidence that settlements, including individual houses, clusters of houses, and, in some cases, apparently, entire villages, were deliberately set on fire and left to burn. This was not the aftermath of accidental disaster or enemy raid in most identified cases. The pattern of burning, the way collapsed and fired clay debris settled within the house structures, and the presence of valuable, intact objects left inside the burned remains, rather than salvaged beforehand, all point many archaeologists toward the conclusion that these fires were intentional acts, carried out by the community itself, on a scale and with a regularity that suggests ritual practice rather than catastrophe. This phenomenon is significant enough and widespread enough across related cultures of this era in southeastern Europe that archaeologists have given it a name, the burned house horizon. And it raises an obvious question: why would a community deliberately destroy its own homes, homes built with real labor, real time, real material investment, and then, in many documented cases, rebuild very similar structures nearby, sometimes directly on top of the burned remains of the old one. Several theories have been proposed, and none of them commands universal agreement. One theory suggests renewal and purification, that houses, like the agricultural fields and the yearly cycle the pottery symbols seem to celebrate, were understood to have a natural lifespan, and that ritually burning and rebuilding them was a way of symbolically renewing the household, the family, and perhaps the wider community, echoing the same cycles of death and rebirth suggested by the spiral and solar imagery found throughout their art. Another theory points to practical and social factors, that periodic burning may have served as a kind of social leveling mechanism, destroying accumulated household wealth and possessions on a regular basis, preventing any one family or lineage from building up disproportionate material advantage over generations. In a society that shows little archaeological evidence of hierarchy or elite accumulation, a practice that periodically reset household wealth to something closer to equal might help explain how such large communities avoided the sharp inequalities that so often accompany settlement growth elsewhere in the ancient world. A third theory focuses on practical structural concerns, that wattle and daub houses, after years of habitation, may have accumulated pest infestations, structural decay, or sanitary problems that made periodic controlled burning a genuinely practical form of household hygiene and renewal, which then took on ritual and symbolic significance over time, as practical acts so often do in human cultures. It's entirely possible that the truth involves elements of all three explanations, blending practical necessity with symbolic meaning in the way that human ritual so often does. What's clear is that this practice, whatever combined logic drove it, was sustained for centuries, across an enormous territory, and it means that the Cucuteni-Trypillia landscape, as archaeologists now understand it, was one of continual transformation, villages and even entire megasites rising, burning, and rising again, in cycles that may have mirrored, quite deliberately, the same cycles of sun, season, and renewal painted so carefully onto their pottery. The people of Cucuteni-Trypillia were not isolated. Archaeological evidence shows connections stretching outward in multiple directions. Copper objects and raw copper, likely originating from sources in the Balkans, appear at Cucuteni-Trypillia sites, indicating exchange networks reaching into neighboring Chalcolithic cultures. Salt, essential both for food preservation and human diet, was mined and traded from sources within their own territory, including notable salt spring sites in the Carpathian foothills, and appears to have circulated as a valued commodity across considerable distances. Flint tools were another significant trade good, with high-quality flint sourced from specific quarry regions and distributed across the wider Cucuteni-Trypillia world, suggesting organized long-distance exchange relationships even in the absence of anything resembling a centralized state to manage such trade. This picture of connectivity matters for understanding the art. The remarkable consistency of pottery style and symbolic motifs across such a vast territory was not the product of isolated communities each independently arriving at similar ideas. It reflects a genuinely interconnected cultural world, one where potters, traders, and travelers carried not just goods, but styles, techniques, and, we can reasonably infer, the beliefs and stories that gave those styles their meaning, from settlement to settlement across generations. Every civilization, eventually, changes into something else, or fades away. Cucuteni-Trypillia was no exception, and its ending, like so much else about this culture, remains a subject of active research and debate. By around 3000 BCE, the pattern of enormous megasites that had defined the culture's later centuries began to break down. Settlements grew smaller and more dispersed once again. The elaborate painted pottery tradition, which had reached extraordinary heights of technical and symbolic sophistication, gradually simplified and eventually gave way to different ceramic styles altogether, as new cultural influences entered the region. Several factors are generally discussed as contributing to this transformation, and most archaeologists today favor an explanation involving multiple interacting causes rather than a single dramatic event. Climate change is one significant factor. There is evidence of a drying, cooling trend across the wider region toward the end of the 4th millennium BCE, which may have placed increasing strain on the agricultural systems that had allowed the megasites to grow so large in the first place. A civilization built on the reliable fertility of black soil and consistent rainfall would have been vulnerable to any sustained shift in that pattern. Environmental and agricultural strain from within is another factor some researchers point to. The enormous long-term populations of the largest megasites, sustained for generations on land farmed using Neolithic and Eneolithic techniques, may have gradually exhausted local soil fertility and nearby woodland resources, straining the very system of surplus agriculture that had made such large settlements viable in the first place. And finally, there is the question of migration and contact with new peoples arriving from the Eurasian steppe to the east. Communities associated with new burial customs, new material culture, and, in later millennia, the broader linguistic and cultural transformations connected to the spread of Indo-European-speaking peoples across Europe. The nature and extent of contact, exchange, conflict, or assimilation between Cucuteni-Trypillia communities and these incoming steppe groups remains genuinely debated among specialists, and the picture is almost certainly more complex, more gradual, and more regionally varied than any single narrative of sudden displacement or invasion would suggest. What we can say is this: the painted world did not vanish overnight. It faded gradually, over generations, as the enormous settlements dispersed, as new material cultures and new burial customs entered the region, and as the descendants of Cucuteni-Trypillia communities were, in various ways across different areas, absorbed into, blended with, or transformed into the cultural landscape that would eventually give rise to the Bronze Age societies of southeastern Europe. The spirals stopped being painted. The great settlement rings were abandoned to grass and forest. And for nearly 4,000 years, this civilization, once home to some of the largest human communities anywhere on Earth, simply disappeared from human memory, buried beneath the same rich black soil that had once made it possible. So why does any of this matter now? Partly, it matters because Cucuteni-Trypillia challenges assumptions we often carry, usually without examining them, about what civilization requires. We tend to associate the rise of large, complex societies with kings, with armies, with monumental architecture built to glorify a ruling elite. Cucuteni-Trypillia offers a genuinely different model, a civilization capable of building settlements among the largest on the planet for its era, sustained for centuries, organized instead, as far as the evidence allows us to judge, around shared belief, ritual practice, and an extraordinarily rich, remarkably consistent artistic tradition. It matters too because the art itself remains simply extraordinary on its own terms, regardless of what it meant to the people who made it. The technical mastery involved in painting perfectly mirrored spirals onto a curved clay surface, by hand, without a wheel, using pigments that could not be corrected once applied, represents a level of skill, patience, and aesthetic sophistication that deserves to be recognized alongside the artistic achievements of any better-known ancient civilization. And it matters because, in the end, the questions Cucuteni-Trypillia art was likely trying to answer are the same questions every human culture eventually asks. Where does the sun go at night, and why does it return each morning? Why does rain fall, and why does the earth respond by bringing forth grain? What happens to a life, or a household, or a community when it ends, and can anything of it be renewed? A civilization without writing answered these questions the only way it could, not in words, but in an endless, patient, repeated language of spirals and circles and waves, painted onto the clay vessels that fed their families and, in a way, are still speaking to us today. We will likely never know, with full certainty, the exact stories the Cucuteni-Trypillia people told about their spirals, their goddess figurines, or their burning houses. Those stories were carried in spoken language, in memory, in ritual performance, and all of that was lost the moment the last speaker of that world's beliefs passed away, unrecorded, into the same earth their ancestors had painted circles to honor. But the pots remain, the figurines remain, the great circular outlines of their settlements, still faintly visible from the air, remain. And in the careful, patient work of archaeologists piecing together broken pottery, sherd by painted sherd, something of that ancient painted world continues to speak, not in words, but in the oldest language humans have ever used to make sense of their place in the universe. Shape, pattern, color, and symbol, repeated with devotion across 100 generations. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people built no pyramids, they wrote no scripture. They left behind no names we can read. What they left behind instead was a world painted entirely in spirals, a quiet, patient, 5,000-year-old reminder that long before history as we usually tell it began, human beings were already looking at the sun, the rain, and the turning of the seasons, and finding, in the shape of a circle endlessly unwinding, a way to say, "This too will come again."